Look around the fitness industry and you'll see the same debate happening over and over again. On the one side, low volume works best, versus you need high volume on the other. But funnily enough, scientifically, this debate has been settled for a long time. But just to sanity check myself, I called Dr. Mike and asked him one simple question. If you had to give the average natural lifter one piece of advice to improve their progress over the next, say, 6 months, for the average natty, what would that be?
If you're not completely overwhelmed and your XYZ muscle group that you're trying to get bigger feels like it's strong and recovered since the last time you trained it, consider adding one more working set to that muscle group's menu for that week and reiterate that formula every single week that you're not deloading. It is absolutely crystal clear at this point from the research, much of which you and your colleagues have done recently, and much of which you and your colleagues have agglomerated into excellent reviews and meta-analyses, that per muscle, the top end limit for how many weekly sets cause the biggest hypertrophy is just way higher than most of us had any conception that could be the case. And there are understandable reasons why most people didn't guess it, because in the context of whole body lifting, systemic fatigue for strong people is really high. You're just not going to do 40 sets of everything. You're going to fucking die. Totally. But if you're working on your chest or your biceps, and your chest and biceps feel pretty good after the last session, and you come in, let's say chest biceps you do on Mondays and Thursdays. If you did, 10 sets of chest and 5 sets of biceps on Monday, you come in on Thursday and your chest feels totally fine, like very recovered. You ask yourself the question, like, next Monday, could I do 11 sets and still recover Thursday? If the answer is like, yeah, probably, just add another set. And you can continue to iterate like that for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you're going to get two things: really fatigued, and much bigger. Because 10 sets of chest twice a week is 20 sets total. We know from very good data now that the vast majority of people in our training studies will not maximize their growth from 20 sets of chest per week. It's great growth. It's not maximum growth. More people, like if you and I went to a muscle casino, and someone was like, all right, we got two groups of random people in AI simulation. One group gets 25 sets of chest. The other group gets 20 sets of chest. Everything else is the same. Who's going to grow more muscle? Like Milo, at this point, looking with literature, it'd be real dumb to bet 20 is the answer. Real dumb. And to be completely honest, bro, a much more interesting question that's very difficult probably for you and I both to answer is, one group has 50 sets of chest. The other group has 45. Who's going to grow more? I think you and I would both be like, I don't know, like intuitively, like, fuck, 50 is a lot. How long are they training? Is 8 weeks total progression, linearly, no deload? Like, maybe 45, but then again, maybe it's 50. Like, I don't even know, right? So because the top end limit is unknown and very high in most cases, and because you don't have to guess, because if your muscles feel under recovered and you're getting weaker, don't add any volume, just stay to your normal volume. But if you really can add. And there's like a number of muscles for me that come into the equation as like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Hamstrings, right? I mean, there's only so much hamstring work you could do until you have delayed onset overlapping soreness and you're like, I'm just going to pull my hamstrings off the bone. This is fucking stupid. For sure. Cool. We got to like mitigate that a little bit. But Milo, think about side delts. I mean, is there a number of side delt raises you can do to where you're underperforming 3 days later in another side delt exercise? Like, yes, but it's numbered in the set, like 15 sets of side delts. 15 sets of side delts 3 times a week is 45 sets. In most of the studies, 45 sets is illustrated as like the highest level of growth ever recorded in a study relative to other growth. And okay, yeah, fuck. And it's not like a fun thing because you're like, man, a stupid thing. Like I remember people were complaining a lot about earlier versions of our app where the adjustment algorithm wasn't as easy, where you could just like say, I don't want any more sets. And also we had, remember back in the day, we had templates that would auto progress you in set numbers. And people would be like, dude, I can't fucking do this, man. This thing is just burning me to the ground. And it's like, yeah, but it's growing you though. That's how growth works. So that would be my biggest thing is like, if you're recovered and you feel pretty good, add a set. It's the most certain way to enhance hypertrophy. It's more certain than lifting heavier. It's more certain, even unfortunately, than like cleaning up your technique, because how you clean up your technique could make a difference. It's just like adding volume is the most scientifically dependable way. As long as you're going pretty close to failure, your technique's not the worst thing in the world, and you're actually hitting the target muscle, adding another set is the most dependable way to grow more, period. As far as I can tell, for the time being.
To really determine the impact of training volume on muscle hypertrophy, the best thing we can do is look to the research. And as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the research, the picture has been pretty clear for a long time, going all the way back to a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues from around the early 2010s. In this meta-analysis, the researchers performed several analyses looking at the effects of volume on hypertrophy. First, they categorized volume into being low, moderate, or high. High was defined as being over 10 sets per week per muscle. That isn't high by modern standards, but at the time, we didn't have that many studies on the topic yet, and that was kind of the highest we had observed. However, in categorizing volume into low, I believe below 5 sets, medium between 5 to 9 sets, and high above 10 sets, the authors clearly saw the higher the volume was, the greater the hypertrophy observed. These findings persisted no matter the sort of analysis the authors performed. But that was one of the very first meta-analyses on this topic. There have been several more since. One of the more recent ones was a meta-analysis by Basval and colleagues a few years ago. They categorized volumes into moderate and high volume for our purposes. Moderate volumes were between 12 to 20 direct sets per week per muscle, whereas high volumes was above 20 sets per week per muscle. So again, you can see how the volume literature has shifted over time into exploring higher and higher volumes. Specifically, the authors focused on 3 muscle groups, the 3 muscle groups with the most research: the biceps, the triceps, and the quads. In comparing moderate volumes to high volumes for these 3 muscle groups, only one of the 3 significantly showed greater hypertrophy with higher volumes. However, if you look at the results closely, all 3 muscle groups directionally favored higher volumes, meaning that generally speaking, on average, within these studies, more muscle growth is seen when doing higher volumes, in excess of 20 sets per week per muscle. So what does that mean? Well, it means that while we didn't have a ton of studies for each individual subgroup analysis, or for each individual muscle, in general, the studies did seem to favor higher volumes. It's just that when you're dealing with 4 to 6 studies, you may not pick up on a true effect, even if it is there, because statistical power and sample size are relatively low. And that's where the final and biggest meta-analysis on training volume comes in. And this one was published only a few months ago. And that's a meta-analysis by Pelland and colleagues. Yet again, they looked at the effect of training volume on muscle hypertrophy. But this time, they had far more studies to work with, and they adopted a slightly different analysis model. In their analysis model, they effectively charted the relationship between volume and hypertrophy when volume was seen in a continuous fashion, meaning trying to look at, for each individual set being added to your training routine, how much more muscle growth will you observe? Whereas previous meta-analyses had focused more so on categorical analyses. For example, comparing more moderate volume range of 12 to 20 sets to 20 plus sets. And when they adopted this continuous model approach, they observed the more volume was performed, the more muscle growth was seen. And that was true all the way to 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets. But wait, let's rewind a little bit. What does fractional mean? Because it's the first time I've mentioned it in this video. Well, fractional volume simply refers to the idea that compound movements train several muscles at once. So, while a set of bicep curls, for example, might count only as one set for your biceps, brachialis, and brachioradialis, how should we count a lat pull-down, for example, or a dumbbell row? Well, we likely shouldn't count those movements as a full set for the biceps. After all, it's unlikely the biceps are truly reaching muscular failure in this movement like they would during, say, a bicep curl, where nothing else can really give out. Additionally, oftentimes, compound movements compromise on the stretch position for more so secondary muscle groups like the biceps. So they had to come up with some sort of system, or they wanted to see rather, which method of evaluating volume was most accurate. So they actually compared which model of volume best fit the data. Was it that only direct training counted, meaning that each movement only counted for the primary muscle group involved, like a barbell bench press for the chest, a lat pull down for the back, but not for the biceps and not for the triceps? Or was it somewhere in the middle, meaning a fractional model, wherein a lat pull down, for example, would count as a full set for your lats, but only half a set for your biceps? So somewhere in the middle. And when they compared these 3 approaches, counting all volume directly, all volume indirectly, or all volume fractionally, somewhere in the middle, that model fit the data best. And therefore, that's likely how you should see volume. That compound movements, for example, do contribute stimulus towards even the smaller muscle groups or secondary muscle groups, but not quite as much as for the primary muscle groups involved. And when they viewed volume fractionally, as was suggested by their analysis, they observed going all the way up to 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets per muscle group per week was beneficial for growth. But it goes even further. In their analysis, they found that around 25% of how much muscle growth someone observes could be attributed to how much volume they were doing. So, simply going from a low volume approach to a higher volume approach could get you around 25% of your total potential gains It is that big of a player when it comes to maximizing muscle building. If you want to level up your training, check out MyoAdapt, the app I co-founded to help you apply the science from this channel. It builds evidence-based routines around progressive overload and smart exercise selection, lets you emphasize the muscles you care about, and tracks progress automatically. Train anywhere, at home or in a gym, in as little as 15 minutes, and switch between gyms seamlessly. Head to MyoAdapt.com and use code WOLF for a free 2-week trial. You can also book a free call below to see if we're a good fit. I'll work with you directly to optimize your training, nutrition, and recovery. Big thank you as always to Rascal Apparel for supporting the channel. You can use code WOLF for 10% off their training gear at rascalapparel.com. Since this paper was published, however, many people have tried to poke holes into it, and rightfully so. That's what we should do when it comes to research. Specifically, they've pointed out a few things. They've pointed out that perhaps these results are only valid in the context of short rest times, which is oftentimes what happens in these research studies. Indeed, researchers don't really want to have participants in for 3 hours when they're doing high volumes, and so oftentimes they adopt 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets. Or maybe high volumes are only beneficial when you're a beginner, because as you get more trained, you are able to train a bit harder, and you impose more fatigue, and therefore the relationship between volume and hypertrophy shifts meaningfully as you go from beginner to advanced. Or finally, some people even claimed, I don't think these results really apply if you're training to failure. After all, if you're training to failure, each set is more stimulative, but also more fatiguing, and therefore, you don't need as many sets, and you certainly can't recover from as many sets. Fortunately for us, the researchers actually looked at all of these research questions using subgroup analyses, effectively grouping the data into different categories to see whether individual variables, like whether or not participants trained to failure, like how long the rest times were, or whether participants were more advanced or more beginners. In grouping the data into different categories, they were able to see, does the shape of the relationship between volume and hypertrophy change much depending on what you're looking at? And the answer? No. The relationship was robust to both shorter and longer rest times. So whether you're taking a minute of rest or 3 minutes of rest, more volume does still lead to more growth, generally speaking. Likewise, whether participants were untrained or trained didn't seem to meaningfully alter the shape of the relationship. And finally, most studies actually had participants trained to failure to begin with. And yes, whether participants trained to failure or didn't train to failure, more volume was still beneficial. So clearly, for over a decade now, the research has been relatively settled on the idea that you need to perform high training volumes to maximize muscle growth. The only thing that's really changed is what we consider high training volume. Over a decade ago, that was just over 10 sets per week per muscle. Now, that's closer to 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets per muscle, which is notably higher. And that's mostly because we've gotten more research on the topic. However, how should you take this volume on a weekly scale and split it up into individual workouts? Whereas the meta-analysis by Pelham and colleagues focused on weekly volume and hypertrophy, Remmert and colleagues focused on session volume and hypertrophy, effectively answering the question, how many sets should you do per session in order to reach your desired weekly volume per muscle? So if, for example, you're doing 30 fractional weekly sets for your back, how should you split that up? 5 workouts with 6 sets each, 2 workouts with 15 sets each, or even 1 workout with 30 sets? There has to be some answer in the middle that is actually going to deliver the best muscle building effects. Here's what they found. Just like for weekly volume, there were diminishing returns with additional per session volume, meaning that for each individual additional set performed, you saw a little bit less of a benefit to your muscle growth. That first set you do for a muscle in a given session is vastly more impactful than the 11th set. And speaking of 11 sets, they found that up to around 11 sets per muscle per session, greater hypertrophy was observed. However, once studies looked at going past around 11 fractional sets per session, it was relatively unclear whether doing more than 11 sets actually led to more muscle growth. Therefore, as a good heuristic, what I use as a coach and as a trainee, for every 5 to 10 sets you're trying to do per muscle group per week, add 1 workout to the week for that muscle. So whatever split it is you're using, push, pull, legs, upper, lower, full body, just make sure it allows you to train a muscle once for every 5 to 10 sets per week you're trying to do. And so depending on how much volume you do, that can really open up different routines for you. If you're aiming for lower volumes, say 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle, a push-pull legs routine where you train each muscle twice a week can work really well. If you're attempting to train with higher volumes, say 20 to 30 or 30 to 40 sets, upper lower routines or full body routines tend to work better given this heuristic. However, there's an additional consideration, which is that on a non-local level, instead on a systemic level, for your full body, there is likely a cap on how many sets you can productively do in a single session. In my experience as a coach and as a trainee, most people can do productively around 20 to 40 sets per workout. 40 sets at the top end, especially if that workout is composed more so of isolation movements, more so with shorter rest times, more so with follow from failure training, etc. Or closer to 20 sets, especially for the lower body, for more compound movements, with longer rest times. You get the idea. At some point, with excessively high volumes, people simply tap out and don't necessarily give it their best effort yet, which is something we'll get back to in a moment. But before we do, I want to address one common criticism of the volume research, and that's that if you're trying to train with 20, 30, or even 40 fraction weekly sets per muscle, you're almost certainly going to overtrain. And there is some merit to this idea, and that's because what we do in studies doesn't perfectly mirror or equate what we do in the real world. Oftentimes, in studies, when we're trying to investigate the relationship between how many sets you do and how much muscle you build, we're focusing on 1 or 2 muscles at a time. And that's simply because of how research works. We don't have infinite resources, we don't have infinite staff, and so when it comes to investigating a research question, we always want to take the path of least resistance or the most efficient path to answering that question. And in this case, training 1 muscle with 30 sets a week takes far less time than trying to have participants come in and train their whole body with 30 sets per muscle per week. However, what that means for you in practice is that you cannot necessarily extrapolate the results from the volume research to individual muscles to your whole body. Because doing 30 sets for 1 muscle at a time and training everything else with, say, 5 or 10 sets is one thing. Training all your muscle groups at once with 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets might be something different entirely, and might be something that can lead to overtraining, you might say. However, to be perfectly honest, based on the research, I don't think this is a huge concern. On the one hand, anecdotally, we have had bodybuilders for decades and decades do high training volumes, close to failure, and not overtrain. For example, in the more modern era, to quote someone or name someone you might have heard of, Eric Helms has been training with 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets for many muscles at once, close to failure, sometimes even past failure using length and partials, recovering just fine and building a ton of muscle in the process. Likewise, some of the biggest bodybuilders across history, people like Ronnie Coleman, Arnold Schwarzenegger, have actually trained with high volumes, close to failure consistently, and built their best physiques off the back of that training. Finally, when it comes to the research itself, we also have surprisingly little evidence of overtraining being a consideration. First, we have a review by Bell and colleagues, which looked at all the research in lifting that was available looking at overtraining as a concept, trying to see, in all the protocols we have used in the literature, in studies, even the ones that were designed to induce overtraining or overreaching, did we consistently observe evidence of true overtraining? Overtraining being defined as a consistent and maintained reduction in performance lasting months. And the answer is no, not really. Even in protocols as extreme as daily maxing out on the squat, we didn't really observe evidence of true overtraining syndrome. Likewise, when it comes to the volume research itself, we also have studies that have had participants do as many as around 150 total sets for their body across the week and still recover and grow more muscle from doing this high of a volume. For example, in a study by Brigado and colleagues, that is what they did. When you're doing 150 sets a week, that's 20 sets every single day. So it seems pretty clear that overtraining isn't something that just magically happens. In fact, I would say that underdosing your training volume is a far more likely problem than overdosing your training volume and ultimately overtraining. On the flip side, when it comes to underdosing volume, what do you think is the simplest way for someone to know if they're not doing enough volume without having to track every single detail?
There's a few things. One is your muscles seem to be completely recovered like the day after training. That can happen with smaller muscles that don't take a lot of damage in many exercises like biceps and shoulders, etc. But then you had better be pounding the volume every fucking day. So if there's a big discordance between recovery, progression, and session frequency, you have a problem. So that's actually probably my best answer. Let me explain that really quick. You train your chest Monday and Thursday, twice a week. I talk to you on Tuesday evening, and I go, hey man, I'm your training partner. And I'm like, dude, I got this thing coming up Thursday. I have a trip with family. I can't get out of it. Any way you can train chest tomorrow, Wednesday morning. And you're like, touch your chest, you move around. You're like, fuck yeah, hell yeah. I never even got sore. I never even got tired. Like I could have trained chest like Tuesday night. Man, there's only 2 answers to that question. You either should be training chest 3 days a week if you're doing that low of volume, or your volume in each session needs to be higher. Because to me, the hypothetically ideal training volume and frequency combination is the one you can barely recover from to train productively again. We know the more volume you do, the better, all things being equal. We also know that training under-recovered is not a sustainable practice. So that blends those two variables together to say, like, well, the most you can do, the better. Two more analogies, both are going to be stupid. Enjoy the analogy ride. You meet up with a girl that you live in a different city than, and you're just having amazing, fantastic, wonderful, consensual sex fun. And it's only for a weekend, and then you can't see each other for like a few months after. How often are you banging? Well, whenever the tissues are ready again, bro, you hit it again. Like, you're trying to bang as much as possible, and you only have 48 hours. You can't be, going to like theme parks and shit and be like, oh, we only banged once. So like, I thought you guys wanted to bang a lot. Like, oh, I guess we fucked it up, No way. But also, if you're banging so often that you're under recovered, you're like, ow, 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 this hurts. I'm not having any fun. And she's like, I haven't had fun for hours. You're like, okay, this is too often, right? As soon as you're ready to go again, you go again. Same thing with eating for mass gaining. I used to ask one question to people that couldn't gain weight. One question for people that couldn't gain weight. Do you want to throw up right now? No. Why aren't you eating? Oh. You get it, Milo. Like, if the food's not coming back up, you put food down your mouth. If that doesn't work as an iterative formula, you're just never going to gain weight. Start steroids or something. You know what I mean? But almost nobody tries that. And so a big mistake I see people make is like, yeah, did 3 sets of squats Monday. Going to come back Thursday, do 3 sets of leg press. And you're like, is it going to take you until Thursday to recover from that? Like, no, fuck no, I could do that again like now. And you're like, well, just fucking do it now then. And they're like, oh, but I want to be, here's the other thing. I want to be my strongest on Thursday. Okay. Well, from lots of literature, that peaking for strength and even just general strength training requires a lower systemic fatigue load chronically than hypertrophy training. And by the way, hypertrophy training is not special. Endurance training is like 70 miles a week these motherfuckers are running. You're just beat up all the time. And so strength training is almost the great illusion, the great distractor from hypertrophy training, because you end up being like, man, I'm going to beat crazy PRs for sets of 5 in a squat if I do, just 3 sets a week. And that's very true. But at the end of that, you're just going to grow very little muscle. And someone who hasn't hit major PRs on load is going to hit crazy PRs on volume and have like way bigger quads. And you're going to be like, oh, God damn it. So you have to figure out what you're training. If you're training for size, as often as you are recovered, fill up as much volume as you can to recover on time for your next sessions. That's a huge mistake people make in training, underdosing volume.
Yep. I think it all comes down to the sort of overtraining boogeyman, where everyone's told, oh, make sure you don't overtrain, make sure you recover. But oftentimes, 95% of people should have the opposite concern, where it's pretty hard to overtrain, and most people aren't even close.
100%. And, some people do overtrain, and then they tell their stories, and everyone kind of freaks out, as well they should, about like, oh, I don't want to be that person. And that's total respect. But at the other end of the day, it's like, yeah, but is that you? It's like finding out that someone died in a race car accident, and then you go to the Chipotle down the street, and you drive your car at 5 miles an hour. Like, okay, that, that's
There's
not
a spectrum,
you, man.
Which we're both
There's
on.
a spectrum. Oh boy, are we on it? We're on top of the spectrum. I don't even know what that means.
As always, when you are trying to determine whether you're doing too much, simply look at your performance. If you're able to lift the same weight as last week for the same number of reps, chances are your recovery is just fine. But if your performance starts to dip consistently for a week or two at a time, that is an early sign of overreaching and in the longer term of potential overtraining. But always look at performance for your individual gauge of whether or not you're training too much. As I mentioned, I think the main thing to pay attention to when it comes to increasing sets is only doing so when your performance is consistent or going up, because that is a surefire sign that recovery is ultimately occurring. If your performance is the same or up, good. Keep increasing volume, as that will likely increase muscle hypertrophy. Now, looking at the empirical research on volume, training to failure, etc., we generally see that more is more. And you've kind of espoused the model of using some proxies in your training to guide whether or not to add volume, for instance. Do you see any risk that using soreness, pump, perturbation, I think, or disturbance in the muscle you've previously stated as well, proxies like those, do you see any risk using those to auto-regulate volume and that might cause people to train with too little volume? And if so, how could you avoid that in using those proxies?
Yeah, definitely. It could be that soreness doesn't really mean much. And if you get too sore, you just train through it and your body gets used to it and you just keep growing more muscle. It could be that after you get mega crazy pumps and then you're doing so much volume that your pump in the workout actually reduces and you're still training, that actually has nothing to do with growth. It's like a proxy for nothing. And then you end up cutting yourself off and not going far enough. That's totally possible. Another thing is if your training is insufficiently frequent, you could be getting such crazy soreness that if you just increase training frequency, you would get much less sore and you could pound in way more volume. So those are realistic concerns. The problem is that two things. One, in my experience, there are tons of variables that interrelate to those proxies that form a relatively convincing picture that they're instructive variables. I have many times gone to the point where I'm doing overlapping soreness for my muscles, and I've almost always either gotten hurt or my performance is substantially tanked a few weeks later, and I'm like, okay, I'm actually lifting less weight. I can't get to failure as easily. This is not the formula for gains. This is clearly the formula for fucking myself up. And with pumps correlate incredibly well to growth on almost every measure. Take almost everything that has been validated by science to cause more hypertrophy. It almost certainly gives you better pumps in the gym. I don't know of any exceptions to that. Down to dieting. Like if you are carved up and have tons of energy, you get better pumps. If you are depleted down, getting pumps is really hard. Growing is really hard. And so because those proxies to me seem sensible, they're the best guess. And it's unfortunate they are. What I would love is a very, very empirically based, mechanistic way to determine how much more volume can I do and still grow. Some kind of maybe cell-free DNA, they looked into that, didn't do anything. Some kind of elements of muscle damage detection, some kind of very precise strength tracking. Those things could be, and also like strength is something we look at too, rep strength. If your rep strength starts going down, I don't think doing more volume is the answer. Like getting weaker is usually a sign that you're under-stimulating and there's under-recovering like crazy. And so combining those pumps and soreness and strength, I think together form a pretty intelligent system. But to your point, it is limited because it's inferential. It's not directly empirically related. Unfortunately, we don't have anything directly empirically related. And we need some kind of top-end buffer. Because if there's no top-end buffer, we're going to burn a lot of people to the ground. You can't just tell people to train for 45, 50, 55 sets a week, because lots of those people will never recover. I have suffered 2 acute types of muscle disruption, 3, one in my quads, one in my triceps, one in my chest, that have taken 10 years of productive training away from me from simply doing too much volume in a few sessions in a row. It fucking neuromuscularly screwed up my muscles in a way that I still don't understand. Nobody knows what it is. It is absolutely possible to locally overreach a muscle. It either ends in injury or some sort of dysfunction or just really shitty gains for weeks and weeks and weeks. Mm-hmm. And so for me, some kind of top-end limiter that seems sensible, like soreness, pump, performance, is, I think, better than not. Here's the really cool thing, though. All of those things allow you to train much more than you would have thought, because at first, soreness is really intense. And if you don't go crazy and you just do a few sets, after a week or 2, you need 3 sets to get as sore as you did. And then you need 4, and then you need 5. And you're like, dude, holy shit, a few weeks after this, I'm going to need 10 sets to get as sore. And I'm like, that's great. And they're like, does it really mean I need to do 10 sets? Like, yeah, you can recover from 10 sets now, and you will grow more from 10 sets. So soreness, pump, and strength adapt to volume, which I think gives credence to the idea that your volume should be something you progress. You don't just start at 45 sets, but you can take it really, really high, especially if you use similar exercises for a while, which we know we should be doing from other kinds of data. Then yeah, like at some point you can do a lot of leg presses and you get only as sore as you used to with 2 sets, but now it's 6 sets, and 6 sets will grow you more. You just have to earn the right to do 6 sets, because instantly blasting your volume to the moon is, as we know from other empirical work, a really good way to get hurt.
Another common criticism against the high volume training camp is that not everyone actually benefits from high training volumes. And there is some truth to this, but at the same time, the people making these critiques are also missing out on something valuable. First, let's touch on what they got right. We've conducted some research into the topic of individual response variation. That's scientific jargon just referring to the idea that different people respond differently to different training approaches. Meaning that, for example, individual A might respond best to high rep sets, whereas individual B might respond best to low rep sets, and therefore grow more muscle with low rep sets, whereas individual A would grow more muscle from high rep sets. As it currently stands, there is no robust evidence suggesting suggesting people respond differently to anything but training dosage. And that's where training volume comes in. If your lifestyle predisposes you to have really poor recovery, then high volumes will still be better for you, but what high volume is changes. For example, let's say your sleep is terrible, you have high stress, and you tend to not get much physical activity in. Your recovery might be far worse than the average person. Does that mean that low volumes are better categorically for you than high volumes? No. It just means that where other people might benefit from up to 30 sets, for example, per week per muscle, you might only benefit from 10 sets per week per muscle. Because if you go any higher, you'll start overtraining. However, what is overwhelmingly unlikely to be true is that you will respond better to 5 sets a week than 10 sets a week. The shape of the relationship doesn't change, but where you cap out based on your recovery changes. So high volume is categorically better, but what high volume means for you can differ. So if your recovery is piss poor, maybe you max out growth at 10 sets instead of 30 to 40 sets for the average person. However, no matter what, you almost certainly won't grow more muscle from 5 sets than 10 sets if you're able to recover from 10 sets. The shape of that relationship fundamentally does not change. Or at least that's our best scientific understanding at this stage. Now, I know this video was all around why you're not doing enough sets to maximize muscle building, but there are absolutely cases where more volume may not be the answer. For example, let's say you truly do have the time to train in the gym for 10, 20 hours a week. There can be people who are truly recovery constrained, wherein you're training so much in the gym that if you just spend your whole time going hard and adding sets and training close to failure, you actually do hit your recovery limits and your performance starts to dip. In that case, adding more sets will become counterproductive. You will likely grow less muscle by adding more sets. But that simply isn't the case for nearly anyone. Because of the amounts of volume that the average person can benefit from, as seen in the literature, being close to around 30 to 40 fractional weekly sets, the true amount of time it takes in the gym to hit your true recovery ceilings is far more than most people realize. And that's where the next thing comes in. If you don't have much time in the gym and you're already hitting your session limits in terms of how much time you can spend in the gym, oftentimes adding more volume obviously isn't the answer. It's not practical. Instead, other levers for increasing stimulus and time efficiency, like training closer to failure, can be a much better answer. And that's where the low volume crowd does get things right occasionally. If the main point of a low volume approach is to take a bit less time in the gym, fit into more people's schedules, and compensate for it by training to failure or past failure, that can be a great approach to training when you want to minimize the time in the gym or have more time for things outside the gym, simply put. Finally, there is one other case where simply adding more volume won't be that effective. If you're already doing high volumes, or even moderate volumes for that matter, and you find yourself dreading the rest of the workout, and you, as a result, tend to find that you don't actually push yourself as hard as you could on each individual set. In other words, your effort suffers. Then, adding more volume will likely only further that issue, and the quality of each set starts diminishing. And that's where the whole mantra of execution is everything does come in. In exercise science, there's a phenomenon we refer to as the pacing effect. Essentially, we're referring to the notion that when you have a lot of work left, you tend to take it a bit easier to prepare yourself for the upcoming effort. This applies not just to lifting, but to things like running as well. As an example, let's say you know you're about to run 10 miles. You might run that first mile a lot slower than you would if you only had to run 1 mile, because you knew that after that 1 mile, you were done and you could head home. So generally speaking, the more volume someone adds into their session, on average, the quality of each set tends to diminish a little bit. There's going to be a huge amount of variation in this. Some people can get past just fine and still put maximum effort into each set. But if you've noticed, the quality of each set starts to diminish because you've added in more sets, oftentimes that's not a trade-off worth making. Because yes, you might be adding a tiny bit of stimulus to your session, but you're adding far less stimulus than you could if you truly treated each set with respect. So before you add volume, make sure that each set is actually treated with a proper execution, because otherwise adding in more volume just results in junk volume, adding in more volume without necessarily adding more stimulus. But with those caveats out of the way, I genuinely do think that around 90% or more of people in the gym would benefit from doing more volume. And in order to do that, here are a few practical tools you can use. The first tool is drop sets. A meta-analysis by Coleman and colleagues showed that drop sets as a technique are just as effective as traditional training while taking up to 30 to 70% less time in the gym. Here's how to do a drop set. Start out with a relatively heavy set of 4 to 12 reps close to failure. Picking a relatively heavier weight allows you to not have to do endless reps in the drop set overall, and as a result oftentimes make it more difficult to reach failure. So start with a heavy set of 4 to 12 reps close close to failure, and then immediately, without resting, drop the weight by 20% and immediately perform another set. Oftentimes you'll get in the neighborhood of 4 to 8 reps, and that's fine before reaching failure. Drop the weight again by 20% and repeat the process for up to 2 to 4 weight drops. This technique allows you to get a ton of stimulus on a given movement in not much time, and is best suited to stack-loaded machines and cable exercises, since you can easily adjust the weight and get going. The second technique I would recommend is paired supersets. Several studies have looked at the impact of paired supersets on performance and generally found no detriment, and several studies, around 4 studies now, have also looked at the effects of supersets on muscle growth and also found no detriment. However, using this technique often cut down on session duration by up to 40 to 50%, meaning your workouts get up to twice as time efficient. To do a paired superset, simply take 2 or more movements. You could even turn this into a tri-set or circuit training. Perform a set of exercise A. Take about a minute of rest and perform a set of exercise B. Take a minute of rest and go back to exercise A for a set. Repeat this process for as long as it takes to complete all sets of exercise A and B. Whether you take closer to a minute of rest or closer to 30 seconds depends on whether you're supersetting upper body exercises, isolation exercises, compound exercises. Generally speaking, lower body exercises, compound exercises, and for higher reps will require a bit more rest, closer to 1 minute between exercise A and exercise B, and closer to 30 seconds if the opposite is true. This technique is great if you're supersetting 2 movements or more movements with similar equipment requirements. Always look for exercises that share equipment requirements, like a pair of dumbbells, for example. The final tip I have to increase training density or time efficiency in the gym when it comes to volume is not taking too much rest between sets. I used to think that resting for 3 to 5 minutes between sets would maximize hypertrophy. And so, when doing say 20 sets per session, I would be in the gym for an hour and a half or 2 hours. However, it turns out that we were kind of wrong. We've conducted meta-analysis on the topic and found that 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets is sufficient to maximize hypertrophy. Now, if you're training lower body movements, compound movements, higher reps for example, oftentimes closer to 2 minutes or potentially even a bit more might be reasonable. But if you're doing upper body work, isolation work, etc., closer to 1 minute is reasonable. Just going from 3 to 5 minutes of rest between sets to say 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets can roughly double your time efficiency in the gym and allow you to get twice as many sets in a given workout, which will definitely increase how much muscle you build. Because indeed, as I mentioned, we found the same stimulus was obtained from a set whether you take 1 to 2 minutes of rest or more than 2 minutes of rest between sets.